you're currently sitting in the salubrious basement of Little Shop of Heroes, the comic store in Dunfermline. This is our ostensibly our back issue area, where we keep all of our older comics, which are £1 each, a magnificent £1 each. The wonders of the comic book industry mean that as soon as a comic has been out for more than 4 weeks and less than 30 years, it's worth £1. So within that within that time gap of 4 weeks and 30 years, you have essentially got a £1 comic. And we're here to talk about the fabulous Spectrum of Adventure, the wonderful book that is about the best genre of computer gaming in history, which is text-based adventures. Not everyone's cup of tea, but definitely mine. And we're here with Tom, who's going to be discussing the book. Tom is the author of the book, and clearly also passionate about Spectrum text-based adventuring.
Thanks very much for having me today, Alby.
Not at all, you're very welcome, and thank you for enduring the slightly damp environs. So first thing I'm going to ask is very, very simple. Why did you write a book about text-based adventures on the ZX Spectrum?
Well, you never forget your first love. And for me, that was the Spectrum. Right. 5 million units in its heyday, and it's still going strong today. And I've never forgotten the good times I had in the 80s with these text adventure games. Mm-hmm. And I was really very keen, for the sake of posterity, to catalogue just a small sample of some of the games that were available at the time.
That's fair enough, I think. I can remember the sense of wonder when I first loaded up The Hobbit, which was the very first one I played. I know it wasn't the first one, but it was the very first one that I'd played. And obviously once I'd got the volume and the tone correct on the tape deck and it was all installed, just entering that world, a world that was something that triggered your imagination. So you weren't limited by the limitations of the 48K of memory and the graphics that it could display. Yeah. The only limit was your own imagination. So I can absolutely understand why you're so keen on the subject.
Yeah, and it's amazing how influential that game's been. I mean, I've seen recent interviews with Veronica Meckler, who programmed it, and it's astonishing to see just the impact it had on individual lives.
Yeah, I mean, it did on me. It came bundled with the book, which was fantastic, and it meant that it also exposed countless amounts of people to the book for the first time. I mean, some of us were going to it after reading the book and thinking, I must play this game, but for lots of others, it actually exposed them to the book in the first place. Yeah. What I would say is, though, and I'm going to get this question out of the way very quickly, because it's always been my bugbear, and it's something that people who have never played text-based adventures or have dabbled casually always complain about. Parsers. It has to be said that with 48K and a lot of story to tell, sometimes the text commands are a bit tricky.
Yes, that's very true. And I think when adventure design systems came out, like the Graphic Adventure Creator and the Quill, I think parsers became more standardised as the decade went on. But some of the early games, absolutely, there are some interesting commands to be had, and a lot of head scratching as you try to work out what those commands were.
Oh yes. Part of the art of the game was not completing the puzzle, but working out the word that was required to complete the puzzle.
and when you mention that, I mean, the one that springs to mind, there was a game called Shrewsbury Key, which was brought out by Player Software in the mid-80s, and there's a puzzle where you have to get through a hole in a hedge.
Okay.
And I seem to remember spending weeks on that one trying to work out what the answer was. Intriguing war with words.
It was always a challenge, wasn't
yes,
it?
It
yeah,
was.
Absolutely. A challenge of the memory of the computer system. Yeah. So, the 80s are considered the golden age for interactive fiction. What is it that you think that makes that the golden age?
Well, in terms of a genre, I mean, I think the easy answer to that is probably Infocom, who produced almost all of their games in the 1980s, and were probably at the head of the game when it came to producing interactive fiction, particularly for American audiences.
Okay.
Now, the Infocom games were never available for the Spectrum, even the 128K Spectrum, or the disc-based version of Plus 3 that came out a few years later. But in terms of certainly British gaming, there was just such a plethora of titles. I mean, if you look on websites like World of Spectrum, you're looking at perhaps 2,200 titles, not all of them in English, to do with text adventuring, and they were just so inventive. They really were. I mean, it was really the golden age where you could get somebody sitting in their spare room coding a game which they could then go and sell to a publisher, and it would be guaranteed a fairly wide audience. So from that point of view, I mean, there were just so many different subgenres to play with. I mean, obviously sci-fi and fantasy were a big part of it, but there were a lot of different sort of dramatic titles and thrillers and things like that as well. So from that point of view, there was just so much going on, and I think nowadays with the internet and internet-based communities, it's easy to overlook just what a fantastic community there was back then. Everybody was buying magazines like your Sinclair and Spectrum, the Sinclair User and things like that. And obviously, if you wanted clues for the games, you had to go and buy the magazines and read the columns. So from that point of view, I mean, I think it's good because even now, obviously there are online preservation societies that keep these magazines alive. It's interesting to look back and see just what was happening in the community at the time.
Definitely. I mean, I can remember playground conversations, discussion groups about how do you get past X level or Y level in a particular game. How big of an effect do you think the Spectrum, the importance of the Spectrum itself and its ease of use was, and added on to that, how big an effect on creativity do you think the limitations of space made?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, actually. I mean, I know that Clive Sinclair in the early 80s seemed very keen for everyone to get involved in home computing. I think he really saw it as being the future. It wasn't simply a commercial concern for him. And he, in more recent years, has said that's one of the tragedies, as it were, of modern computing, is the fact that there is so much more available in terms of capacity, graphics cards, things like that. When people were left with the Spectrum's architecture in the 80s, they had to be inventive. You had to find creative solutions to programming challenges. And I think he did that, well, I think the programmers of the time did that brilliantly. And it's how they did that, how they overcame these issues, particularly with arcade games. Where you're looking at bespoke system architecture that had to be replicated in some way on the Spectrum, that even if you weren't replicating the experience directly, you were still giving some kind of taste of what the original game was like. So from that point of view, I think there was a lot of creativity, and that was certainly the case with the text adventure games. Because I mean the ambition was incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, the ambition was you've spoken about it earlier actually. The diversity of topic and the ambition of the game was phenomenal. The 80s itself was an interesting time. Pop culture wise, politics wise. Do you think that had an effect on the games?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see a number of games from the 80s with a definite political slant, or socio-cultural slant, certainly, and I think because it was a high watermark for satire, programs like Spitting Image and that kind of thing being on at the time, there's definitely an attempt to replicate that in the games of the period. And I think you see it most definitely in games by places like the St Bride's School and Delta 4, where you see a lot of generic parody, which in its way indirectly sends up a lot of what was going on in pop culture at the time.
Parody has played a big part in text adventures, though, of course, as well. I mean, famously, there's Boggett and games of that nature as well. So, did literature inform video games or text adventures, or did the text adventures inform literature?
I think there's probably an element of both, to be honest, because interactive fiction, I guess, must have started with those adventure books where you can choose what direction to go in if you want to go in.
Turn to page.
If you want to go left, turn to page 2. If you want to go right, turn to page 5. That kind of thing. So I mean that had been going on. Obviously, role playing had been a huge thing as well. Tabletop role playing. So I suppose really what you see in the 80s is a logical progression of that kind of interactive narrative. But it's intriguing that kind of thing is still with us. I mean, it evolved obviously into the point and click adventure game in the the 1990s. But I mean, even now, if you look at the Black Mirror movie Bandersnatch, I mean, you're still seeing the same kind of principles playing out now. It's that interactive narrative aspect, I think, that's what interests people.
Do you see a place now for purely text-based adventures, or adventures with static images and primarily text?
Well, there does seem to be a market for it, which is interesting. I mean, you see an awful lot of people now in independent programming communities, homebrew programmers who are very interested in the challenges of it. And I think really it is that issue, the challenge of presenting this kind of narrative experience. Often, if it's for a retro computing system, then you have obviously the architecture of the time to deal with as well. So, I mean, there's a challenge of having to come to terms with that and building on what other programmers have done in the past. So, I think there's an element of that, certainly. But I think there's also the issue now of this kind of cross-pollination of literary sources and things like that. The famous one probably being Fergus MacNeill's The Big Sleaze. It came out in 1987, which was beautifully written, incredibly skillful parody of the whole Raymond Chandler, Mickey Spillane type of detective fiction. But again, able to parody modern cultural phenomena as well. So to be able to do that in such a intriguing way, because obviously you split the game over 3 parts and you were able to travel back and forward between the parts, depending on obviously what you were doing, what kind of puzzles you were solving at the time. But it was a good way of fitting a much larger playing area into a fairly restricted amount of memory.
Right. So, well, a very restrictive amount of memory initially, certainly, with the 48K. I don't think the 16K machine was an initial foray, but the 48K was the one that pretty much everyone had. What influence, the quality and breadth of the games we've alluded to, so the lack of different platforms that were accessible at the time. The Spectrum, I think at the time you fell into a Spectrum or a Commodore camp. You were either you were a Commodore 64 or you were a Spectrum person, and the Commodore 64 had its advantages with sound and slightly with graphics, which I think made the Spectrum a more logical place for games of this nature. Do you think the lack of different options helped focus people's attention on that system?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, I was a non-conformist because I had an Amstrad CPC. But
did you have the green? Was it the green screen?
No, it was a colour one. It was a posh one.
That's fancy.
But no, I switched over to the Spectrum at the end of the 80s. So I got a plus 2A.
Okay.
And that made the difference. That was up to 128 kilobytes then. That was luxury stuff,
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, you had these sort of big 3 systems, and they say predominantly the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, that dominated in the 80s. And it's very interesting, that rivalry, which still exists today, over what one was the best. But yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think perhaps the advantage the Commodore had was that it did have access to the Infocom games if you had a disc-based Commodore. And I think that was the intriguing thing, because with the Spectrum there was much more of a focus, whether intentionally or not, on British programming and British publishers. And from that point of view, you had titles like the Magnetic Scrolls games that came out for Plus 3. I mean, that was the absolute gold standard of British interactive fiction at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot to be said for both systems actually, and a lot to commend them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not partisan. I mean, I'm a kind of a collector of old computers, and so I love them all for their own individual reasons. But the Spectrum for me always felt like more accessible for the home user. It felt more accessible from the perspective of being able to create something for it, rather than have to go out and buy your goods in. It always felt like, well, I can do that. I can see myself creating something of that nature. Is there an evolution in the games throughout the 80s, do you think? Or or I suppose more elegantly put, what are the points in the 80s that the game suddenly evolved? There must have been particular games that took a great leap forward.
I think that point probably came around about the mid 80s. I think if there was any kind of golden age within the golden age, it would be about 1986.
Right.
It's an interesting thing because when The Hobbit came out in '82, it was so sophisticated and so ahead of its time, and it had even things like spatial awareness, where you
Yeah.
could put objects inside objects and things like that. It really broke the mould quite early on, and it raised the bar very high from that point onwards. So really, an awful lot of the other games in the early '80s, '82, '83, many of them are fairly simplistic in comparison to The Hobbit, and there was this sense, I think, of people scrabbling to try and replicate some aspect of that
Okay.
magic, which I think in many ways they achieved. Come '84, you have games coming in which really challenged expectation, turned things on its head. In many ways, we're coming back to genres that have been explored in the early '80s and sort of revisiting them in a
Right.
slightly different way. And then you have games like Sherlock, for instance, which had this detective-based puzzle system in it, which was very innovative for its time. You then have the parody games that Melbourne House brought out, games like Terra Molinis and Hampstead and Dodgy Geezers, which were really innovative titles and really challenged people's view of what you could do with an adventure game at the time. And then I think you hit these watershed moments where you have people like Fergus McNeil and Delta 4, where he really started to hit the ground running with games like Robin of Sherlock, the Boggart you mentioned earlier, the Big Sleaze, games like that.
Yeah.
Really ambitious games which really went into a lot of detail, which really challenged the spectrum, pushed the spectrum to its limits, that kind of thing. And then, of course, near the end of the decade, you get games like the Magnetic Scrolls games you mentioned earlier, games like Jinxter and Corruption and The Pawn, which were really as perfect a brew as you're ever going to get of good puzzles, atmosphere, and not on the Spectrum but on other platforms certainly had really good graphical accompaniment as well. And it says a lot actually that Strand Games are now re-releasing these Magnetic Scrolls games for Android and the iPhone.
I was going to mention the evolution of these games. It seems to me that the power of modern smartphones, it's infinitely more than anything that was around in the 80s. So, and these text-based or text and graphic-based adventure games seem perfect fodder for someone sitting on a train or someone sitting in a bus. And what a wonderful way to while away your commute, playing one of these amazing games from the early 80s or late 80s. And that is something that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that's really keeping the flame alive, as it were, because this is not new text adventures, although there are new text adventures to be had on iPhone and on Android platforms. But really, what's interesting about it is the fact that, as you say, it's never really gone away.
No.
It's perhaps not as mainstream as it once was, but it's people just find an aspect of charm and a sense of engagement, I think, with it as a genre, which has kept it going.
It's quite funny. We define mainstream probably slightly different from the mainstream.
Yes, that's very true.
And that we are sitting in a cellar surrounded by comics discussing a very, very specific niche within an incredibly specific niche and describing it as mainstream.
Yes. Mainstream, but your mileage may vary.
So, have you found yourself discovering or rediscovering any old favourites from the 80s, or have you found yourself discovering for the first time during the research for your book anything that you'd completely overlooked?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say a bit of both, as a matter of fact, because my all-time favourite text adventure game is The Very Big Cave Adventure by St Brides, which was released by CRL. And it's just absolutely pitch perfect. In two ways, actually. One, because it sends up the Colossal Cave Adventure so well, and all of the strange, abstruse puzzles that came with that original, really very formative adventure game. But also because it just, obviously, you can tell the people who are involved in it really enjoyed themselves.
Right.
Because the jokes are really funny. You kind of get the feeling that an awful lot of thought went into it, and it parodies everything. There's literary parody, there's cultural parody, there's, in a sense, political parody in there as well. It's just an absolute masterclass in really good adventuring by people who clearly had a good time doing what they were doing.
Right.
So from that point of view, Yeah, I mean, I think that I was keen to go back and have a look at what other games had come out by the same developer, and it was the same with places like Delta 4, where I played some of the games, but not all of them, certainly not in the early part of the decade, when Fergus McNeil was just getting started. And that led me to a new appreciation of his later work, games like Mindfighter, where he suddenly became serious when they under the abstract concepts label. So there was an aspect of that, but what really impressed me were all of the slightly more niche independent titles,
Okay.
particularly near the end of the decade, because a lot of these games had been homebrew and had never been commercially available. I think we were, to an extent, slightly spoiled in the 80s because companies like Mastertronic saw a niche, and suddenly you were seeing computer games appearing in garden centres and newsagents and places like that. And it was easy to overlook a lot of these games, which were produced often by people in their own homes and sent out by mail order. And that's a great pity because a lot of these games were incredibly sophisticated and beautifully written. So it gave me an opportunity to revisit, or in some cases to discover for the first time, a lot of these games. And that has, I think, really been the great pleasure of having written the book, is that so many of these titles that had never really occurred to me before had come to the forefront.
I would say I found that also, and that it was great to read the book, or it was great to flick to the sections of the book that you had done the adventure, and to read about it and reminisce. But one of the fantastic things about it was just almost flicking through and stopping randomly and looking at a page and realizing I've never even heard of this label, let alone this game.
Yeah.
And this game sounds to me to be absolutely fantastic and right up my street. And you tend to forget now that now you just Google something and it'll tell you where you can get it and how to get it, and within 2 minutes you can have downloaded it. Whereas in the 80s, your access was geographical to some extent, or happening to read about it in a specific magazine. So you didn't have access to all the fantastic things that were available at the time.
Yeah.
I purchased my games from a Hoover repair shop. And that was because the person who owned the Hoover repair shop happened to be into games, and so he had a rack with cassettes on it. So it's not like now. So, and the more that they can come out on to things like Android and iPhone, that's fabulous for me. That's a wonderful thing. But this book, Spectrum of Adventure, is an A to Z guide of now games that I have to try and find. because 80% of them I hadn't heard of, and as you said earlier, this is scratching the surface almost of what is out there. So this is 100 games of thousands that are available. So it just shows you the sort of depth of the genre, really.
And that was actually one of the big challenges, was the fact that what 100 titles do you choose to be representative
Yeah,
of?
that'd be very difficult.
Yeah, of such a wide variety of and it is a big library of titles, so that was one issue I had right from the beginning. Was I knew right from the start there would be certain titles I were going to miss out that would be somebody's favourite.
Yeah.
And even right until the last gasp of writing it, I was thinking, do I leave this in, do I take this out? There were just so many. I mean,
do you think you would revisit the Spectrum again?
yes, I think I will be revisiting the Spectrum again, possibly in a year or two. I'm quite keen to look at a different aspect of the system, though, and having looked at the interactive fiction as it directly related to text adventuring, there are other aspects of interactive fiction which were not text-based,
Okay.
and I'm quite keen to have a look at that and to see how different the dynamics were actually in those kind of games. Because I mean, if these games were ambitious, stretching the limits with text-only interfaces, how much more ambitious were these games where there were graphical interfaces?
Yeah, the mind boggles really as to what some of these programmers managed to squeeze out of such a meagre amount of power.
Yeah, I mean, interesting with the comic connection. Do you remember Red Hawk by Melbourne House?
Yes, I do.
And also Stifflip and Co by Palace Software.
I didn't.
No, because they're very comic-oriented interfaces, and you can tell there's a comic strip ambition to try and recreate that aspect of graphic narrative.
Yeah, I mean that graphic style lends itself well to to a relatively low-powered computer system. To be honest with you, you can do something with it. I don't know. I don't quite understand how people who do these things manage to do them, because when you look at the raw statistics, you think, well, that shouldn't be humanly possible. But apparently it is.
That's the magic of machine code.
Yeah, well, apparently it is, and you kind of your mind does boggle. So how long? Here's the question: how long did it take you to write this hefty tome?
It took about a year.
That's not bad.
It's about 3 months of research and then
Right.
about 9 months of writing and research as it was ongoing. Because I was quite fortunate in the sense a lot of the games I had played already in the 80s. So in a way it was a refresher course. A lot of them were entirely new to me though.
Okay.
And obviously you had to play them right through because if you didn't, people would know. Because a lot of people buying the book would be enthusiasts.
Yes.
So it wouldn't be entirely fair to not have some aspect within the book of what the atmosphere of the game was like and the
So
prose
have you
style.
played them all?
Yes,
Wow.
I have. And I can't say I necessarily completed them all, but I
Right.
did play them all. And the reason I say that is because if you were to sit with a playthrough for a lot of these games, you'd lose half the fun.
Yep.
Because a lot of the entertainment value came from really, really abstract puzzles. Sometimes a little too abstract, if I'm entirely honest.
Yep.
But it's interesting from that point of view to look at just how the sophistication of these puzzles developed over the course of that decade. And
You have to wonder about the minds of some of the people who created these games, though.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah. And I think with some admiration as well.
Yeah.
Because surreal, sometimes even absurdist, but always entertaining.
Yeah, I think the one thing that shines through them all, or all the ones that I've played, is that even if some of them weren't fantastic games, and like all genres, there's wheat and there's chaff, and that's the way that it works for them all. But I think they were all a labour of love, in that most of the people making these games were never going to make huge fortunes out of making these games. I mean, even at the time, it was a niche within computer gaming.
Yeah.
And the shiny graphical games where you could run about and hack at things were always going to be much, much more popular than a text-based or an interactive fiction.
Yeah.
But you do feel the passion in the games. So they all bring something to the table, even if the entirety of the game maybe isn't as satisfying as you would love, or the limitations of the language that the person's used in the game isn't the best that it could be. You still get some pleasure out of playing them. And I think what this book has done for me is that it's made me think about the possibility of dipping my toe in again. I don't think I would try and redo all 100. I think no. In fact, I know I'm not going to do 100. But every single one of them is interesting to read about, and that's what I enjoyed about the book. Although it feels like it's encyclopedic in style, it's kind of a page turner because you want to get to the end of the adventure, and then you want to see what the next one's all about. So I found it an engaging read just from the perspective of picking it up and randomly reading it. It didn't feel like I wanted to research something, therefore I need to read this book. It does feel like a page turner. So I think you've done well in conveying the atmosphere of the games and the feeling of the games, and it's not just a book about this is what happened in this game. You do get a feeling that you've played them, which is why I was wondering if you had, and I'm very impressed. It's like so clap. Although it has to be said, it's a wonderful way to spend your day if it's I'm working. The Spectrum of Adventure is a fabulous read. But more important than the book itself, reading the book and then rediscovering the gems that are within its pages, I think, is the most important part. It's made me fall in love again with ZX Spectrum interactive fiction. So I do thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really glad you enjoyed it.
Not at all. Now, I am going to have to play The Hobbit again. And hopefully And hopefully, and this time, I'm not going to feel bad about it being a copy that I borrowed from a friend.
Okay. But will you feel inspired to sit down and sing about gold like Thorn?
I'm always inspired to sing about gold like Thorn.
Okay.
I'm a 1980s style. Who's it, Ed Sheeran? Is there anything else that you would like to discuss?
Well, just to say, do you know, I've written 13 books, and I think this one's my favourite. And the reason it's my favourite is because I really felt I was helping to preserve, in the cultural consciousness, in even a small way, people who had really influenced the way that I look at literature as
Okay.
being something that shifts and develops and evolves. It says a lot that these sort of hypertext fictions are still so popular now and still fascinating people now. And really, in the 80s, Britain had such a vibrant, interesting industry. I was really keen to try and bring it alive for people who had lived through it and people who maybe hadn't lived through
Yeah.
it but were keen to find out more about it. So, from that point of view, of all the books I've done, I think this one's the most personal.
Well, I think actually that's a very interesting point that you bring up about bringing it back into the consciousness. I think you're right, in that there's people of an age. I am one of those people of that age that 1980. Before 1980, the idea of the notion of having a computer in your home, well, was fanciful. In fact, the notion of a computer was fanciful. I didn't know what a computer was, let alone that I wanted one in my home. So I think you're right in that there's generations of people who haven't been exposed to these games, and a book like this, the Spectrum of Adventure, should trigger. There'll be thousands of people out there who don't know that they are in love with this sort of game. And they just have to have the opportunity to have that passion ignited. I think that is a fabulously altruistic thing that you've done. I'm glad it's your favourite book, even though it's allowed you to spend countless hours playing text adventures.
What a hardship that was. It's a hard life, but someone's got to do it.
I think again, also an interesting point of what we have found in the store over the last year or so is that there has been a massive resurgence in Dungeons and Dragons, in the passion for Dungeons and Dragons, and in very, very, on the face of it, technology-free, non-visually stimulating, text-based and imagination-based gaming. And you would think that that would be not the case now. As technology becomes more and more accessible, as visual stimuli are bombarding people, people are constantly looking at their cell phones and watching videos and streaming services, that there wouldn't be a place for that anymore. But it's absolutely to the contrary. We are having huge amounts of people coming in who are regularly playing games of paper and the mind. And these text-based adventure games are very much the market for that. If you enjoy Dungeons and Dragons, and you enjoy tabletop gaming, and you enjoy role-playing gaming, you will absolutely enjoy these games, because these are what these games are.
Yeah.
They are games of the mind. They are games of the imagination. They stimulate your thought process, and you conjure the world in your head.
Yeah, and I mean, do you think there's nostalgia involved in that? Because I think about things like, you see the Crystal Maze, I mean, the meteoric success that's
Yeah.
had as a comeback, and Nightmare with Hugo Myatt.
Yeah.
There's this campaign to bring that back. I mean, do you think there's an
That
aspect?
would be interesting. I think there's certain things like Stranger Things, the TV series Stranger Things, which kind of has a feeling of the 80s about it, and I think that's helped. But no, I think what it is people are starting to realise again that they want to create their own worlds, and these are fantastic fully formed worlds within these games, but you have to visualize them yourself, and everyone's visualization of every game in this book will be their own.
Yeah.
We will absolutely not share that world, and I think people are starting to rediscover that they like that They don't want to have the world shown to them. They want to create that world for themselves. And things like tabletop gaming, role-playing gaming, and these games give you that latitude. They create a world for you and allow you to create the vision of that world for yourself. So every single player's experience will be slightly different every time they pick up the game.
Yeah, and I think that's the magic in narrative, isn't it? Because I mean, if you give 1,000 people a novel, you can guarantee everybody will have a slightly different view in their mind of what the characters are like, what that world is like. On the other hand, if you give 1,000 people a copy of a Judge Dredd comic, you can guarantee they will all have a different view of what Megacity 1 is like off the panel,
off the page. Absolutely, yeah.
What that the texture of that society is like, what the cultural values are, and things like that. And I think that's even films like Blade Runner. That's still inspiring people with just such an incredibly evocative view.
I think you're absolutely right.
The future.
But I think people have forgotten that. I think people have forgotten that is the stimulating thing about literature and art and movies and games, and because things have become so technologically advanced, and the things that filmmakers, movie makers, game makers can do now are so phenomenally good. It's mind-bogglingly good. That for a little while people forgot that no matter how great that was, it pales into insignificance by what you can create in your own mind.
Yes.
They're striving to try and achieve what each individual can create in their own mind, and you're wowed by it, but really inside your own head is something much, much more powerful. And when you expose them to games like these games, suddenly they realise, actually, I'm a fantastically creative person.
Yeah.
I just didn't have a creative outlet, and this allows people to have that creative outlet.
Absolutely.
It's a passive creative outlet. I mean, they're not having to create something physical, but it is still allowing them to have a creative outlet, and everyone loves to have that feeling. Which is why when people watch movies, they'll say, "No, that's terrible. That's not right. That isn't what that place looks like." The reality is that it doesn't look like anything. It only looks like how you've visualized it yourself. So no, this is why games like this are so important, and why the people creating these games have left such a legacy for us all. I think the lack of the power of the computer allowed these people to create worlds that weren't constrained by that, because the imagination is limitless.
Yeah, true. And the fact that we're able to do it in only 48 kilobytes of memory, which is
bizarre.
A decent sized email now.
It's just incredible. That will always be beyond my ability to comprehend. The technical ability to create something. I know we've mentioned The Hobbit before. But you're right. I think we were spoiled by how advanced that particular game was.
Yeah.
Which did mean that everything that came after it for a period of time felt slightly underwhelming, because you thought, well, this is already out, surely the next one must be better. Well, no, actually, as it happens, this person's managed to do something truly remarkable with the technology at their disposal. You just want, and because there is no lack of depth in that game. It's not
true.
Lacking anything.
No. I mean, it even understood things like mass and weight, which are concepts that tend not to come into a lot of other text adventure games.
Yeah.
From that point of view, it was
which are things that modern games on very, very high powered PCs and consoles sometimes find it difficult to do. So modern adventure games, things like Oblivion, where encumbrance and your body size makes a difference to where you can go in those games.
Absolutely.
Whereas in some of these other games, it's an irrelevance.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely true, and it's something I think that probably lends itself more to role-playing games now. And it says a lot for the skill of the programmers, who had a background in computing science and mathematics and things like that they were able to bring that aspect to something that had such a creative drive. It's a really interesting blend of programming talent and vision.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And sometimes programmers are maligned or people have the impression of programmers of being quite dull and quite math based and quite obsessive and not very personable or very social or having much creativity. Well, these games belie that, don't they, really? I mean, the fact is that computer games are made by programmers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly these ones, because they weren't vast teams of people doing crafting these. You didn't. There wasn't one person creating a particular landscape that was only going to be on the screen for 30 seconds. This was a body of work that they were creating for themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is astonishing.
Yeah.
It is astonishing.
It is. It's a period we'll never get back again, actually, and that's
Yeah.
that's the interesting thing.
I think you're right. I mean, everything evolves, but the benefit we have is, of course, that we have the things that are available now, and the things that are available tomorrow. But we've also got the things that were here 40 years ago.
Yeah, and hats off to the people who've preserved all of that software for future generations.
Yeah.
You know, that's all available digitally now.
I know it's tremendous, because certainly I haven't. I mean, mine were all in a shoebox somewhere, and now they are still probably in a shoebox somewhere. But I don't know where that shoebox is.
Yeah.
We have the shoebox that is the World Wide Web now.
Yes.
The infinite shoebox. I'm trademark. Well, thank you very much, Tom. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you about the Spectrum of Adventure. It's a brief history of interactive fiction on the Sinclair ZX Spectrum. It's not that brief a history, it's a very comprehensive history. As I said earlier, it's actually despite the fact that it doesn't sound like it will be, it's actually a real page turner. If you've ever played interactive fiction games, it's definitely for you. If you play role-playing games now, it's something for you. You will want to start playing these games once you've read this book. And if you've got absolutely no idea what I'm talking about at all, it's worth picking it up and looking at the thing that helped create the video games of today, the fiction of today, and the movies of today, because these games definitely helped shape the future of the entertainment industry as we see it now.
Alby, thanks very much for having me here. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Not at all. Thank you.